Welcome to Annotation Codex. I'm Amy Cheek, sharing with you my margin notes on philosophy, occultism, religion, poetry, and politics. Today's episode is called Fate, Unknowable but Certain, Beowulf as the Absurd Man. We're going to be looking at Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus in light of the Anglo-Saxon glorification of the losing battle. Let's begin. Albert Camus, in his 1942 absurdist essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, responds to the problem of nihilism. Once we have realized that we exist in a world devoid of metaphysical meaning and that we are only born to eventually die, how do we cope with the emptiness of it all? With a defiant spirit, he chafes against the condition of being enslaved, as he describes it, to death itself. Camus first rules out suicide as a way of escaping existential despair. For him, self-termination is unreasonable and makes us far too submissive to death, our grim master, and is thus beneath our dignity. He goes on to also rule out having faith in transcendent illusions, which he calls philosophical suicide, unleashing a lengthy critique of Chestov and Kierkegaard, preferring to unflinchingly face the despair of existence head-on, rather than to abandon reason for the sake of comfort. For an acceptable response to nihilism, Camus settles on the notion of embracing the absurdity of existence in a radical attitude toward death that could be expressed as, so what, fuck you, and unpacks what it might look like to fully commit to life as the absurd man. He paints a variety of portraits of this archetype, including the actor, Don Juan, the conqueror, and the creator. This essay examines Camus' absurd man archetypes in connection with Beowulf, the eponymous hero of one of the earliest literary narratives in the English language. Written anonymously in Anglo-Saxon somewhere between 500 and 1000 CE, the poem Beowulf is an elegiac tale of a prolific Geat warrior in the Viking era who fights men and monsters alike in the relentless pursuit of glory. Beowulf's steadfast awareness of his own eventual death, his perpetual participation in cycles of ultimately futile violence, and the willing and complete expense of his vitality render him an apt prototype of Camus' absurd man. Part 1. Already marked for death. The inevitability of death ominously frames Camus' explication of the absurd. Death overshadows and dooms every human action in the absence of the transcendent, making our suffering feel arbitrary and our victories pyrrhic at best. A hollow sense of alienation becomes central to our experience of the world once the nihilism really sets in. Quote, death is there as the only reality. The Beowulf poet also seems to share this sentiment, and cannot resist darkening with morbid foreshadowing the Danes' celebration of Beowulf's impressive defeat of the monster Grendel. The poet says, death is not easily escaped from by anyone. All of us with souls, earth-dwellers and children of men, must make our way to a destination already ordained where the body, after the banqueting, sleeps on its deathbed. The Beowulf poet frequently undermines the tribe's ephemeral victories with the shadow of death in this manner, such as when Hrothgar completes the construction of the magnificent mead hall Heorot. Before the Danes can even stand back to admire it, the poet informs us that the hall awaits a barbarous burning and will one day in the future be destroyed in an episode of internecine strife. Another disappointing anticlimax occurs when the Danish queen Wealhtheow gifts Beowulf a beautifully wrought torque, and the poet flashes forward to tell us that Beowulf's liege lord will one day be wearing it when he dies disgracefully on the battlefield. One surmises that the Anglo-Saxon Christian poet is simply not content to allow the doomed Viking pagans to have nice things. Or perhaps the fixation on death is merely characteristic of the nature of an elegy. After all, this poem both opens and closes with the funerals of mighty kings. Beowulf himself expresses a clear awareness of his own mortality. Before his fight with the monster Grendel, described as a demon and a shadow stalker, who has the power to carry off 30 men at once, Beowulf, who is still at this point a young warrior, affirms several times the possibility that he will be viciously killed. In his boast to the Danish king Hrothgar, Beowulf makes a formal commitment to defeat Grendel or die trying. His matter-of-fact proclamation of the brutality of the death to which he could possibly succumb is particularly sobering. He says, "If Grendel wins, it will be a gruesome day. He will glut himself on the Geats in the war hall, swoop without fear on that flower of manhood as on others before. Then my face won't be there to be covered in death. He will carry me away as he goes to ground, gorged and bloodied. He will run, gloating with my raw corpse, and feed on it alone in a cruel frenzy, fouling his moor nest. No need then to lament for long or lay out my body. If the battle takes me, send back this breast-webbing that Wieland fashioned and Hrethel gave me to Lord Hugelac. Fate goes ever as fate must. The button at the end of his boast, "Fate goes ever as fate must," is an impressive shrug in the face of terror and what would quite literally be the worst possible outcome for him. Likewise, Camus' conqueror in the myth of Sisyphus says, "Our fate stands before us, and we provoke him." For Camus, embracing the absurd does not permit a cowering fear of death, nor does it dignify a complicit longing for it. Death is rather awaited but never desired. Embracing the absurd is to live in spite of death, to stare it down and make it come get you, never losing sight of it, to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. In his boast to Hrothgar, Beowulf is aware of his mortality but not resigned to it, having expressed an intention to be a match for Grendel, grappling hand to hand in this life and death fight with the fiend. Though he could die, the fight against Grendel is not meant to be a suicide mission. Beowulf obviously prefers life to the alternative. In Beowulf's boast before his second battle, the one against Grendel's avenging mother, who has just abducted and beheaded the king's advisor Ashura, the young warrior urges the grieving King Hrothgar to adopt this clear-headed defiance of death. He says, "Wise sir, do not grieve. It is always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. For every one of us living in this world means waiting for our end. Let whoever can win glory before death. When a warrior is gone, that will be his best and only bulwark. Endure your troubles today, bear up, and be the man I expect you to be." Unwilling to tolerate the plaints of Hrothgar's despair, "What is rest? Sorrow has returned. Alas for the Danes, Ashura is dead." Beowulf exhorts the king to be less surprised at death when it happens, and to refocus on glory, dignity, and action. His reminder that death comes for all is the ground upon which he urges Hrothgar to find his footing, just as Camus' conqueror, who says, "Despite everything is death. We know also that it ends everything." The conqueror knows that trying to literally defeat death itself is never the point of fighting the battle. Death is invincible. However, just as Beowulf reminds Hrothgar, there is a battle against death which can be won in the mind. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus characterizes this kind of victory in terms of self-mastery. He says when conquerors talk of vanquishing and overcoming, it is always overcoming oneself that they mean. Regardless of whether or not Beowulf is certain of his strength to prevail against his adversary, he is always certain of his commitment to the fight. Beowulf's last battle takes place 50 years later. His old age and the ferocity of his enemy, a 50-foot-long, fire-breathing dragon, bring him closer than ever to the fact of his own mortality. The dragon incinerates Beowulf's home in a fit of rage, and the old warrior, now king, has nothing left to lose. As Beowulf sits down outside the barrow, steeling himself for the battle to come, he is sad at heart, unsettled yet ready, sensing his death. Several pages of text ensue in which Beowulf reflects on his life and his notable battles and accomplishments, effectively eulogizing himself. Despite his uneasy awareness of his fate, which is described as, quote, "hovering near, unknowable but certain," when it comes to taking action, the old lord does not lose an ounce of defiance, informing his retinue of 11 soldiers that he intends to challenge the dragon in single combat without their help. He says, "Men-at-arms, remain here on the barrow, safe in your armor, to see which one of us is better in the end at bearing wounds in a deadly fray. This fight is not yours, nor is it up to any man except me to measure his strength against the monster or to prove his worth. I shall win the gold by my courage, or else mortal combat, doom of battle, will bear your lord away." Though he knows he will die, Beowulf fights as if he still has a chance. This is the absurd man. For Camus, this absurd godless world is peopled with men who think clearly and have ceased to hope. Beowulf conducts himself in a way that is worthy of his dignity rather than appropriate to the circumstances. His resolution comes not from hope, but from the knowledge that hope is unreasonable. The lost cause is at the center of man's experience of the absurd, which Camus characterizes as the clash of our longing for meaning against the guarantee that we will never find it. What is absurd is being doomed from the start, and the absurd man holds his ground with an attitude of audacious indifference. Camus says, "Lost causes require an uncontaminated soul, equal to its defeat as to its temporary victories." The antithetical contract repeated throughout Beowulf's many boasts before battles, which amounts to, "I will vanquish my enemy or I will die," is a sober expression of that indifference, such that one could punctuate any of Beowulf's boasts with Meursault's "Ça m'est égal" and still remain faithful to the warrior's character. Part 2. Pillage and slaughter have emptied the earth of entire peoples. In the myth of Sisyphus, once Camus establishes that life is absurd and devoid of meaning, he begins to make the argument that what counts isn't the best living, but the most living. He says, "A man's rule of conduct and his scale of values have no meaning except through the quantity and variety of experiences he has been in a position to accumulate." Out of Camus' loyalty to reason and position that values are useless in a meaningless world, he asserts that value judgments can be discarded in favor of factual experience, and thus an absurd life, which depends on a constant awareness of the absurd, should be, quote, "faced with the world as often as possible, seeking out the greatest quantity of experiences with maximum lucidity." Out of all the portraits he creates of the absurd man, his Don Juan is most recklessly focused on this ethic of quantity realized through action. A serial womanizer, Don Juan would fail any test of morality by almost any conceivable standard, but he is an exemplary absurd hero for the fact that he, quote, "seeks quantity in his joys," repeating as many experiences of love as he can fit into his one small life. He is a seducer, and being aware of the meaninglessness of life does nothing to make him any less of one. Rather, he pursues the maximum quantity of love with the maximum number of women, and, quote, "all those deaths and all those rebirths gathered together as in a sheaf make up for Don Juan the flowering of his life." Camus argues that it speaks to Don Juan's lucidity and even wisdom that he does not seek to deepen any one relationship, but rather speedruns as many relationships as possible. While Beowulf is no seducer of women, or even of one woman, he is conspicuously celibate throughout the entirety of a poem full of kings and their wives, and never has a family or children. He is a rival to Don Juan in his pursuit of quantity in his experiences. Instead of love, Beowulf chases glory in battle, and with no less intensity than Don Juan pursuing his next lover. In the closing line of the poem, the poet describes Beowulf as, quote, "the keenest to win fame." And this epithet begins to be earned well before he even fights Grendel at the beginning. He first introduces himself to Hrothgar as one who has already had great triumphs, which include various battles against beasts, trolls, and sea monsters. He has also by this time vanquished several human adversaries, devastating them and avenging the Geats. One could also reasonably add to the tally the rhetorical violence he commits in retort against the snide Unferth, which might as well be considered a bloodbath in its own right. Then, after his new victories against Grendel and Grendel's mother and her countless sea monsters, the poem skips forward 50 years, and before his fatal fight against the dragon, Beowulf chronicles even more instances of winning glory in wars against rival tribes. The battle against the Frisians and Franks, in which his king Huglac falls, Beowulf wins 30 battle dresses in hand-to-hand combat against so many opponents. He later settles a feud against the Swedes by invading their lands with weapons and warriors over the wide sea, and killing Onila, who had killed another of Beowulf's kings. As Beowulf remembers these glorious victories from during the tribal wars, he defines himself by his willingness to always march at the front of the line, eager for the violence that will earn him renown. The most brutal account of such a victory is his killing of Dayraven the Frank, whom he fights in single combat as their two armies look on. He says, "No sword blade sent him to his death. My bare hands stilled his heartbeats and wrecked the bone house." Every victory adds glory to his name and terror to his reputation, and Beowulf devotes his life to mightily and decisively answering every call to violence. It cannot be stressed enough that all of this violence is ultimately meaningless. From the dragon's lair, Beowulf wins treasure, which is a symbol throughout the poem of the accumulation of glory, and the trove is already decaying. The poet says, "The old dawn-scorching serpent's den, packed with goblets and vessels from the past, tarnished and corroding, rusty helmets, all eaten away." Not only is the treasure past use, but also the peace and security he had bought for his people with the sheer force of his powerful reputation, which intimidates enemy tribes and deters them from attacking, evaporates the moment he dies. Wiglaf warns the remaining warriors of the tribe, "It is goodbye now to all you know and love." Because once word spreads that Beowulf has died, all of the Geat's old enemies will come out of the woodwork to exact vengeance upon them for the violence Beowulf had done during his lifetime. The messenger reports to the people that they can expect renewed hostilities from the Franks, the Frisians, and the Swedes. Beowulf's people wail at his funeral, not only for him but also for themselves, as they recognize they are now doomed and defenseless without him. The poet says, "In the path of exile they shall walk bereft, bowed under woe, now that their leader's laugh is silenced, high spirits quenched." The illusion of an indefinitely tenantable world dissipates with the smoke of Beowulf's funeral pyre. His violence did not buy them lasting peace. It merely deferred the violence temporarily, which is now due to return upon them in endless waves. The cycles of revenge remain unbroken, violence breeds more violence, and it seems their world will never change, no matter how mighty the man is who makes his mark upon it. This apparent futility of all Beowulf's glory-mongering reverberates in Camus' Conqueror, who understands his own ephemerality, saying, "This is why you cannot base anything on me. Nothing of the Conqueror lasts." Crucial to any of the absurd man's efforts is the clear understanding that nothing he does can be meant for any transcendent purpose that lives beyond him. The hopeless aftermath of Beowulf's death is the necessarily nihilistic backdrop to his vast repetition of glorious violence, which can be seen as his chosen mode of passionate and lucid revolt against the futility of a life promised to death. Part 3. Excelling himself in daring and danger. Another of Camus' absurd man archetypes is the actor, who pursues the ethic of quantity by living and dying 1,000 times in the roles he plays. In this particular portrait, Camus does not prioritize the irreverent defiance of Don Juan, but instead unpacks the actor's unique emphasis on saturation and embodiment. A theater practitioner himself, Camus is familiar with the ephemerality of the stage and connects the absurd man who must make the most of his life with the actor who, quote, has 3 hours to be Iago or Alceste, Phèdre or Gloucester. In that short space of time, he makes them come to life and die on 50 square yards of boards. Camus points out that an actor lives in 3 hours the fullness of a life that an audience member would take decades to experience. There is a special benediction in the theater that passes from actor to actor, usually before the closing night performance. Leave it all on the stage. Theater is inherently the most fleeting art form. Once the show closes, the whole creative endeavor is completely erased from the material world, only to live on as a ghost in the subjective and imperfect memories of the artists and the audience who witnessed them. This actor's blessing is a reminder to the performer to say goodbye, to drink deeply, to squeeze every last bit of life out of the role they have spent the last few months embodying, for they will never get another chance to do so. Closing night is, as a result, complexly funereal for a theater troupe. Curtain call is the receiving line. Strike is the burial. To truly leave it all on the stage and to fully saturate each moment they have under the lights, the actor must be fully focused on their objective and fully grounded in their body. Camus emphasizes the necessity of the actor's body to intensify and externalize every inward desire and emotion. He says, "The rule of that art insists that everything be magnified and translated into flesh. The body is king." The actor holds as little as possible back in the reserve of their mind and instead channels everything through their posture, their movement and gestures, their voice, and their face for the audience to take in. This embodiment is combined with a kind of saturation, an impressive time-bound intensity with which the actor infuses life into their role. Camus says, the narrower the limits allotted him for creating his character, the more necessary his talent. He will die in 3 hours under the mask he has assumed today. Within 3 hours, he must experience and express a whole exceptional life. The actor is the absurd man because he is grounded in the material rather than the transcendent. He is spurred on rather than daunted by the inevitability of his character's deaths. And he lives out the ethic of quantity in iterating character after character as fully as possible. Beowulf shares and even exceeds the physicality of the actor, as his repeated battles put his literal life on the line. And he is equally committed to saturation when it comes to his episodes of combat. Beowulf's frequent tendency to fight with minimal support, as well as the amount of times he is brought to the brink of death before a close victory, are a testament to his commitment to truly expend his full force in these bouts of violence. Before the fight with Grendel, since the monster, quote, has no idea of the arts of war, of shield or sword play, Beowulf decides to fight him unarmed and unarmored. Against Grendel's mother, perhaps because of her treacherous fighting style or because she lures him onto her turf, he wears more armor and carries a sword, but still goes into the fight completely alone, as he also chooses to do later with the dragon. Strategy would maximize resources. Beowulf has a multitude of soldiers at his disposal and access to any weapon he could ask for. However, his inclination to take on as much of the fight as he can alone, to use every ounce of his own strength in brawny contest against each adversary, harmonizes with the embodied saturation of Camus' absurd actor. Whatever the warrior equivalent is of leave it all on the stage, is what Beowulf does in each of the monster battles where he expends his force to the absolute limit. In his fight against Grendel, Beowulf holds the fiend in an arm lock, and equally matched, the two of them bash each other around the mead hall, bringing the timbers down around their ears. It is only after several pages of stumbling and straining that we hear, quote, sinews split and the bone lappings burst, when Beowulf fatally rips off the monster's arm at the shoulder. Grendel flees to the fens to bleed out. That Beowulf apologizes later, quote, I couldn't stop him from slipping my hold, wishing he could have done more to destroy Grendel on the spot, reveals that Beowulf does indeed discover his physical limits during the fight. In the fight against Grendel's mother, he endures droves of sea beasts who attack with tusks and tear at his chainmail, and when she grabs him in the water, he is unable to overpower her and break free. He, quote, heaves his war sword and swings his arm, but his strength is not enough to harm her. They take turns throwing each other to the floor, and finally, the only way to defeat her is with a sword he finds in her lair, quote, from the days of the giants, so huge and heavy of itself, only Beowulf could wield it in a battle. Again, Beowulf finds himself in a fight that pushes him to the extreme limits of what a man should be able to do. At the end of the poem, during the fight against the dragon, familiar, strenuous diction patterns emerge to capture the physical strain Beowulf endures as he puts his body on the line. For example, struck hard but scarcely cut through, the hard-pressed king, tormented by the heat of his scalding helmet, and most clearly, the war king threw his whole strength behind a sword stroke. Beyond the exertion of combat, Beowulf also endures wounds, such as burns, a bite, and the dragon's venom, that prove this time to be fatal. An actor's physical intensity, for Camus, entails their ability to externalize every inward thought, feeling, or desire so that an audience can see as much as possible of that character's life. Beowulf's physical intensity consists of an externalization of sheer power and might, a true embodiment of his will to glory. Like the absurd actor, Beowulf, through combat, drains something and is constantly on the move, as Camus says. Like each of an actor's performances, each of Beowulf's battles is a rebellion against death, one that, though ultimately futile, exhilarates him with a vigor that keeps him fully grounded, fully lucid, and for the time he has, fully alive. While one core contradiction inherent to the absurd is that we desire meaning in a meaningless world, the other is that in order to experience a life lived to the fullest, we must repeatedly and fearlessly confront the reality of our death. Conclusion. As texts, Beowulf and the myth of Sisyphus might seem like strange bedfellows. However, the earthy straightforwardness of an Anglo-Saxon warrior tale provides perhaps an ideal window for witnessing Camus' absurdist philosophy and practice, a philosophy that refuses to indulge the crisis of meaning. Resisting Sartre's existentialism, which suggests that the individual should construct meaning for themselves, Camus rejects metaphysical preoccupations entirely in favor of embodied action, and one access point for channeling this mindset is to reclaim the warrior spirit of bygone days, which the rebellious, pugilistic prose of Sisyphus genuinely does. Perceiving the hero Beowulf through an absurdist lens imparts to us a pragmatic wisdom that is able to scorn the lifelong, drawn-out fear of death. The ultimate futility of Beowulf's violent world does not merely lower the stakes of the hero's life, it removes the stakes altogether, and we consequently witness an individual liberated from the dread of death and from any debt to the world that lives on after him. Beowulf makes sense of the ethic of quantity. While a truly definitive meaning of life is a largely inaccessible concept for many, the behavior of living is easily found in created experiences. The more, the better. The more embodied, present, and lucid, the better. While the temptation is to look for a deep enough meaning to justify the state of being alive, the absurd man pursues a breadth of experiences that occupy him with the activity of living. Camus' refusal of suicide is not an exhortation to stay alive, but to keep living, which are two decidedly different things. An intellectual defeat of nihilism may not be necessary or even possible, but Camus' alternative is fully illuminated in the absurd hero Beowulf, who, when faced with insuperable violence and the constant specter of death, chooses instead to just throw his sword arm into it and start thrashing. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, and/or Substack. You can also find me at AmyXCheek on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. Thanks so much for listening.